Hi everyone. So, welcome to Navigating Complexity with Ben Ford and Richard Hughes Jones. We are going to be talking for about 25 minutes about leadership, complexity, and we did a little Twitter poll, and we're going to be trying to weave in some emergence into that. So, welcome, Richard.
Hi, Ben.
Hey. Right. So we are live. That's good. It's working. Excellent. So please give us a quick intro, and then we'll just dive straight in.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for this. I believe this was your idea. So
yeah, it was my fault if it all goes wrong.
Thanks for suggesting it. Here we are. I'm Richard Hughes Jones. My business is as an executive coach. My main focus is working with startup and high growth technology businesses, but really anybody, entrepreneurs and investors in that high growth space. I've been really influenced over the last few years by the whole complexity agenda. That's been influenced through some personal life experiences as well, and just really seeing what that brings to the new way that businesses are built and led, I find utterly fascinating. So yeah, just really looking forward to riffing on it here.
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, you and I had a pretty cool conversation the first time we connected a few weeks back, didn't we? And I think, we both recognize that the world that we operate in and the world that, businesses that we like working with operate in is getting increasingly complex, overwhelming. You talk to many leaders and you'll hear them saying that the world's moving too quick. I came across a word a few years back, exponentiation, which I think really sums up certainly the technology world. Doesn't just move quicker and quicker, it moves the space between quick and quicker, moves quicker as well. So I think this will be an interesting conversation given both of our interest in complexity.
Yeah, for sure.
So why don't we kick off? So we did this Twitter poll. The outcome was that more people than not wanted us to talk about emergence. So just let's riff on leadership in complexity and emergence and see where that takes us.
Yeah, sure. So perhaps just to baseline my perspective on this, and for the purposes of this conversation, the space that I work in and I'm fascinated by is this shift as businesses go from, let's say, 5 to 8 people, that kind of really early seedish stage, through to certainly 25, 30, then to 50. You start to see these inflection points, and then on to 100 and 150. You see those other big inflection points when you start hitting Dunbar's number, and we can come back to that. And fundamentally, I was thinking about this before the call. The reason I find this space so fascinating is because there's so much going on. It's so frenetic. And fundamentally, it's so much about it is an emergent process. And actually, I thought it'd be good to clarify the definition, what we mean by emergence, because I think there's a tendency for people to just think that it means change. Something will emerge, it'll become different, and that's partly right, but it's actually more that the fundamental properties of the system change in a way that is, all words I'm sure we'll discuss, unpredictable, non-linear, exponential. And so that, from a leadership perspective, is also quite fascinating in terms of how you navigate that journey. So just that's my baseline for how I'm thinking about this in terms of this conversation. What about you?
Yeah, so I actually wrote an article about social inflection points a little while ago. So I'm, before I was in tech, I was in the military, and I noticed that these social inflection points happen around military unit sizes.
Okay.
So, as a military, you start off with a section which is 8, comprised of 2 fire teams of 4. And as you add units like that together, you add increasingly more sort of overhead and HQ element to each composed unit. So a troop in the Royal Marines, a troop is roughly 30 people, which is 3 sections plus signaller, troop boss, troop sergeant, and then you go up to three of those in a company, and then you've got correspondingly more sort of overhead and communication requirements to keep all that aligned. But that structure is designed for operating in chaos. It's designed to pull out the bits of repeatable behavior that will mitigate some of the chaos while acknowledging that chaos is still going to happen. And this is the other thing about sort of another thing I think people don't quite latch onto when they first come across this is that an exponential growth, it's not the same system when it's 8 people and 50 people. So there's it's not that there is a system with 50 people in it that's grown linearly from a system of 8 people. There's been almost like a phase transition, where something goes from a liquid to a solid. There's that period of increased energy. Well, let's go the other way actually. So let's go from a solid to a liquid. You get to this point where you're just before that transition point, and you add more and more and more energy, and it's not changing, and then all of a sudden, bang, it all goes at once. And I feel like that's the places where I've experienced the most friction have been the ones that have gone past that sort of Dunbar's number fraction without making the requisite changes, and they're trying to do things as they were, and it's just utterly painful all the time.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with someone about exactly that this morning. Often the time I am asked to get involved is once they've gone past that tipping point. And it is sudden, because I think we were going to talk about Metcalfe's law, weren't we?
Shall I stick the slides up?
Yeah, have you got it? Because it's just for anyone that's not familiar with it, it's just the slide will explain it way better than I can. But it is
exponential growth of connections within a network, right?
It is, and actually, the pandemic. I was reading a lot of articles about the extent to which people weren't wrapping their head around exponential growth. I mean, a virus is one of the best examples of this.
Yeah.
And you can see there. So something I often refer to is what I call the coffee table moment, which is something I experienced in my own past career when we were a team of, it's about 8 people. And you make this analogy to a startup. And when you're at that size, 5 to 8, it's not too difficult. You can everyone can communicate with one another. You can see there already at that point, we've got 28 connections in the system.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to 14, you've got 91. And I didn't check what the number was, and I certainly can't do the maths in my head. But once you start getting to even 25 people, you're talking about these enormous numbers of connections where the system just breaks down. Yeah. But it also breaks down. It also goes from being seemingly, it's kind of just working and getting by to broken very quickly.
That's a really interesting one. So I mean, my sort of technical journey has led me into functional programming, which is built on quite fundamental ideas. And there are some quite elegant ways of thinking about how the information needs to flow through that system. So the problem with the diagram that we just saw is that the number of connections grows. But what you have to do, I believe, is choose who connects to who. So that's not like that's what is the emergent property, right? So you have certain playbooks that you can use, like direct reports being no more than 8, and a few kind of rules of thumb like that. But so as the book Team of Teams tells us, right, you have to allow the networks that need to emerge to tackle specific problems, which in today's world is sort of cross-functional teams generally, and those networks sort of overlay the hierarchy. What we tend to have in traditional Western society is the boss and all the people that the boss tells what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, that works in very linear kind of top down stable environments. You know, the rise of the industrial age is, you know, unlimited growth. You could have that structure, but as soon
Yeah.
as we're into kind of chaotic, non-linear, you know, punctured equilibrium is a great phrase from a book about evolution. You know, that going up through the hierarchy and back down to make any kind of connection across silos is just hopeless. And that's
Yeah.
what the transition point, I think, is.
Yeah, I'd push back on you slightly and say that people think it works.
Oh yeah, yeah. It looked like it worked for long enough that people thought it worked.
Yeah, and arguably, yes, and arguably it did work for the last however many decades. Yeah. What I suppose I'm curious what. So we've kind of, I think we've introduced this concept of emergence and complexity and the system changing in ways that you have some control over, but arguably, well, I would say almost certainly not as much as you think. I'd be interested to know how you see this playing out in either, you know, in the businesses that you work with and certainly in the startup and early stage high growth space.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I'll probably start with what doesn't work, since that is probably most people's commonest experience. I think the biggest mistake that we try and make when we fix this problem is thinking that we can build a solution, thinking that there's a, you know, cultural engineering, you know, that you can put blocks together and build something up. I think it's actually much more the case that the only option that you have really is to put the constraints of the system in place, which you can to some degree apply playbooks of things that have worked in the past. But then you just have to be really alive to the evolving conditions that those constraints put in place. So, you know, per Dave Snowden, you know, you're in a complex environment. You can't know exactly what it is you're going to do. Like, you know, even if somebody's taken a company from 50 to 100 people before, right? They might have done that 5-10 years ago. Right? I can tell you that the technology landscape now, in terms of what you can build, and the amount of money that would cost you to build something is totally different, right? So even if someone's done it before, you know, there's this great quote. I can't remember the Greek philosopher, and I couldn't pronounce his name if I could, but no man steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and he's not the same man. So you have to take this kind of, you know, emergent, observational, almost kind of gardenering approach, rather than thinking that you've got, okay, right, we'll take this weed killer and that weed killer and we'll put it all together and we'll get exactly the same result as we had before. Just doesn't work.
And how do you sort of encourage a team or a leadership team or a leader to do that?
Well, I mean, it's got to be about letting go, right? It's got to be about, you know, you have to be able to, at the point of sort of, you know, 30 to 50 people becomes the point as a leader, you have to be able to let go and delegate and allow your company to become distributed. I mean, I'm talking from the point of view of a founder, right? You have to be able to push authority down so that the people that are sharing in you have to create a shared vision and alignment, which is, you know, a very trite phrase, but, you know, maybe we can dig into that if we get time or in another call. Because I know it's a soundbite. And then you have to kind of put in the boundaries within which you want people to operate, let them operate, and then encourage positive deviance, which is, you know, okay, somebody's overstepped their boundaries a little bit and they may have screwed up or it may have been great, but you recognize that they've overstepped their boundaries within their current limits or not, and you adjust their boundaries accordingly. And that's the way that you're able to kind of push. So the great, the follow up to One Mission, the follow up to Team of Teams, which is called One Mission, digs into this really well.
This is McChrystal.
Yeah, it's Chris Fussell is the kind of primary author of the second book. But you know, this is a book where they try and contextualize their experience with some of the research. And I think their formulation of these kind of channels of authority is quite a good one.
Interesting.
How about
Yeah.
you? I mean, you work with, you work with leadership teams. You've got a particular view on it, based on, psychology. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just wrote down the two, you specific things you mentioned were alignment and boundaries. There's others that, I mean, what you said really resonates. So the challenge, perhaps if I lay out the challenge I typically see is that 5 to 8 people, everything's great. Things are all good. Everyone can communicate. Often there's just been, a half decent chunk of cash invested into the business as well. And so then you follow people on that journey. And I think it's when you start seeing it around 20, 25 and on to 30 and beyond. I think, from a leadership perspective, you often get people who, brilliant people. It's one of the best things about my job is the people I get to work with. But they're not necessarily experienced leaders. So they don't necessarily know what they don't know.
Yep.
And they're also going from, this is hard. It's hard. You go from perhaps, in the space of 18 months or 2 years, you go from, managing 2 or 3 people maybe to leading a team of 15 or 20. So that is not easy. And, wrapped up within all that is this emergent process that's going on around you. I think, the challenge I then see is people developing as individual leaders, but also developing as a leadership team.
Yeah.
You talked about and perhaps we should save the whole holocracy argument the other day, because I can get quite heated of my views. But let's assume we're not in a holocracy right now, but you've got these certain levels of hierarchy forming.
Yeah.
And yeah, often, so the challenge I often see is leaders going off in their own direction and not, that not bringing that back to the core. So I think, working with leaders to help them. So I do a lot of, leadership team coaching, just trying to bring, all these leaders managing these emergent teams back together, psychologically safe space at the center where they can have these conversations and, fundamentally communicate and develop as leaders together. And within all that,
let me ask you something. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you there, but there's a thing that's been on my mind a little bit. Some observations from the military. So I think we can separate leadership into a skill and the system, right? I think certainly the military. I've been in situations where I didn't actually think that the leader that I was working for was particularly skilled, in terms of empathy or just being a nice person. Not that that's always necessary to be a good leader, obviously. So that was a situation where the leadership was still of an extremely high quality, but the skill of that individual leader wasn't necessarily that high. So I wonder if you could maybe just sort of unpick any differences you've noticed in leadership as a skill versus leadership as a system.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the fundamental thing I'm noticing with the sort of, let's call them, newer leaders, so people who are developing as leaders, is I think there is that. I think there's a big piece in here for me, and bearing in mind I'm a coach, so my job isn't to sort of tell people what to do in that traditional sense, but I'm certainly noticing that there's a piece around learning and developing the skills of leadership. There is just simply going away and reading, listening to podcasts, actually learning about these things. But then in terms of, you talk about the system, right? I think there's a whole other piece, and this is of real interest to me, around something that's referred to as the difference between horizontal development and vertical development. Horizontal development is learning new skills. If I'm bad at presenting to my team, I can go and learn how to be a better presenter. That is part of the process of looking like and being a better leader. But in complexity, actually, a lot of these things that we're talking about are very hard to learn in a book, because it's more about the way that you process things cognitively and emotionally. And I think, the whole space that we work in is very good at equipping people with horizontal skills. Twitter's full of advice about what to do. But
actually, I'm just going to pick up on what I should have said earlier. Skill versus system is slightly misleading, because it's actually knowledge. There's actually three points to this triangle. It's knowledge versus skill versus system, right? Because you can be extremely knowledgeable about something. Like, for example, when I learned to program, when I learned to program Haskell, which is a very kind of academic language, I spent way too much time reading and getting a lot of knowledge about the programming language. But actually, until I started to type stuff and actually build the skill, that knowledge was somewhat useless. So I think that's slightly what you were into there. So maybe if we can separate knowledge from skill from system, maybe that might.
Yeah, I mean, to build on that as an example, the example you used earlier was the letting go point, which is an inherent skill in an emergent system. It's also deeply unintuitive. Especially if you're a leader. Your natural tendency, as the system emerges and almost gets away from you, is to shift into, it's human nature. We want to control. If we control, we can bring it back. But you're fighting a losing battle in an emergent system in a growing business.
Yeah, although I mean, if you're a new leader coming into a business that's in a real mess, actually, paradoxically, applying a load of control might be it usually is the right way to start. So there's that kind of difference between complexity and chaos. If everything's a complete garbage fire, then arguably control is the first step, because you need to sort of put the flames out before you then figure out, how to remove the fuel source, to really stretch a poor analogy.
No, I think it's a great analogy. I think it's a beautiful example of one of the fundamental characteristics of complexity is nuance, and things are not black and white. There is gray in between. You react differently to different situations. I think it's a great example of, it's very hard to read and learn about that in a book. I think there's a risk that we build leaders we build leaders who need the playbook, and playbooks don't work so well in complexity. Kind of sense-making tools and the like do. I think playing around in this space, and it's sort of helping leaders move beyond those horizontal skills, those things you can go and learn, to helping them sort of develop more the kind of cognitive and emotional skills and capacity to navigate this stuff. To see what's, in this situation, this might work. In this situation, this, we need to do this. I think it's a big part of the space I play in.
In fact, I've got a fantastic example of this. So, I mentioned before that I've been listening to this podcast, the Jim Rutt Show, and the most recent guest was a chap called Tyson Yonker-Porter, who's an Aboriginal academic who's written a fantastic book called Sand Talk. But he had a brilliant example there. So, anthropology, and so much of our kind of current understanding about how people operate in, what causes stress is this whole kind of flight or fight response. Everyone's got chronic stress because their flight or flight response is always triggered. And he was saying, well, you know what, fight or flight response from an anthropological point of view came from the minds of Western people viewing Paleolithic type societies and putting themselves into that position. So, oh, if I was living in this place and I saw a tiger, I would be terrified and I would either fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, you know what, actually, that's not what happens in people that have grown up in that environment. Like they're embedded within their context, so to such a degree that they just know where all the tigers are, right? There's no unexpected tiger jumping out of the woods, out of the bushes, because you're in tune with your environment so much. So much of this is contextual, and from points of view, it's very, very difficult to jump from one of these points of view to another and really properly take the third person perspective and understand not just how I would react in that situation, but how would I react if I wasn't me and I'd grown up in this and I was basically completely different.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful summary. I mean, our fight or flight response has so much to answer for. It really does. I mean, it underpins so much of our behavior.
Yeah,
I'm writing a blog post about it at the moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at our own procrastination about getting on video and overthinking it and flapping around.
Yep. No, we've gone with the safe to fail experiment approach, which is one way of navigating complexity. And my thoughts on that. I mean, I think you're so right, and I think this is a big thing I'm playing around with in my head at the moment, and also how I bring it to the leadership work that I do is, if you are saying, or I am saying, and I am saying that the world is inherently uncertain.
Yeah.
When you're working in a business context, you are operating within an emergent system. How do you lead in that system in a way in which you can hold the uncertainty and the inherent complexity a bit more lightly? Because if you're not holding it lightly, fundamentally your amygdala, your fight or flight response, is twitching away.
Yeah.
And the psychology or the biology of that is that's actually disturbing. It's inhibiting your thinking, your creative thinking.
Yeah, and it's interesting that I mean we were talking about exponentialization earlier, right? The whole system, the whole economic system that we are part of is built to expect certainty, right? It rewards certainty. It rewards, it rewards people who can tell you exactly what's going to happen. And that's sort of the Western, the way the Western world has evolved over the last couple of hundred years. But then you've got Eastern philosophy where paradox and uncertainty are actually best mates, right? There's actually no problem with having a paradoxical view of the world, and it's much more about it's much more about we versus me as well, which is another completely different lens, which I don't think we should dig into now because we're at 28 minutes. Maybe we should.
Great to dig into at some point, though.
Yeah, maybe we should wrap this one up, and we'll see what conversation unfolds, and then maybe schedule a follow up.
Yeah, just really super quickly, I think because it's one thing we haven't talked about, and it's a big thing in from a leadership perspective, is that taking the perspective of others as a tool for navigating complexity. Super important to sort of bring it back to what we're here to talk about. That's
sort of, there's a great bit in that podcast I mentioned also about how tribes sort of sense make and tell stories about what their history and their cultures is. It's fantastic. Maybe we can dig into that one next time as well.
Yeah.
But this time we're at sort of 29 minutes, so let's wrap up. So Richard, that was really good. I think we should definitely do a follow up. I mean, I could literally stay talking about this for several more hours. So let's get another one in the books, maybe this time next week, or well actually no, I'm going to be on a boat this time next week. So but sometime in the future.
Definitely.
Have you got any final kind of comments or words? Where can we find more about you and your blog post?
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, first of all, Superb. Really enjoyed it. Let's definitely do it again when you're back from your holidays. Yeah, no, I mean, Twitter, website, richardhughesjones.com. And I've got a newsletter as well, which I send out monthly, which is just sort of trying to dive into fundamentally what does the future of leadership look like. So yeah, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Commando Dev on Twitter. If I know there's a few people watching at the moment, so they know who those are. But this is for people who are watching on YouTube. So commando.dev is my website. I'm building a course, actually, trying to contextualize everything I've learned over sort of 20 years of research and integrate that with some of the things I observed about what works managing complexity in the military, and that's specifically aimed for tech startups and a lot of the kind of leaders that we were talking about just now. That's on Gumroad, and you can find that pinned in my Twitter profile as well. More details to follow if you happen to be watching this on LinkedIn at the moment. But yeah, until next time.
Superb. Thank you very much.
Cheers.